It was a quiet neighborhood, one where people mostly kept to themselves. But everything changed the day Karen moved in. From the moment she became the head of the HOA, things started going downhill. Karen was the kind of person who loved control. She'd walk around the neighborhood with a clipboard, knocking on doors, issuing warnings, and making life difficult for anyone who didn't follow her absurd rules. One of her biggest issues? The trees in front of the judge's house. Karen always had something to say about them. Those trees blocked the view of the street, she would complain to the neighbors. They're too big, they make the place look messy. But what she didn't know was that those trees weren't just ordinary trees. They had been there for years, providing shade and beauty to the home. Karen, of course, didn't care. She never really liked being told no, and when the judge refused to cut down the trees, she decided to take matters into her own hands. One day, without any warning, she hired a crew to come in and cut down every single tree in front of the judge's house. It was early in the morning when the chainsaws started roaring, waking up the entire neighborhood. Neighbors gathered, some confused, others angry. But Karen stood there, arms crossed, watching as the trees came down one by one. She had a smug smile on her face, confident that no one could stop her. After all, she was the HOA president, and, in her mind, that meant she had all the power. But what Karen didn't realize was that this wasn't just any homeowner she was messing with. She was cutting down trees that belonged to a federal judge, and he wasn't about to let this slide. The neighbors watched in disbelief as the once beautiful front yard was reduced to nothing but stumps. "She's really done it this time," one of them whispered. "Doesn't she know who lives there?" Another shook their head, knowing full well that Karen had no idea what kind of trouble she had just brought upon herself. Karen, of course, was too blinded by her own ego to care. To her, this was just another win in her book of HOA victories. She strutted away, leaving behind a yard that was once full of life, but now looked desolate and bare. What she didn't know was that the storm she had unleashed was far from over. The judge hadn't said a word yet, but when he did, it would be something Karen would never forget. The day after the trees were cut down, things seemed calm. Karen, feeling triumphant, went about her usual routine, issuing more warnings to the neighbors. But what she didn't know was that the judge had already begun working on his plan. Unlike Karen, he wasn't the type to make a scene or confront her in the street. No, his approach would be much quieter, but far more devastating. Karen might have been in charge of the HOA, but she had no clue about the laws she had just broken. Those trees, as it turned out, weren't just private property. They were protected by local ordinances, ones that Karen hadn't bothered to look up. Worse still, Karen had overstepped her authority in a way that went beyond just neighborhood rules. She had trespassed onto federal property. The judge, being who he was, knew the legal system inside and out. He knew the exact steps to take, and he wasted no time. Instead of confronting Karen directly, he filed a legal complaint. Karen, in her arrogance, thought nothing of it. To her, this was just another angry neighbor complaining about her improvements to the neighborhood. But as the days passed, she began receiving letters, ones that were far more serious than the usual HOA complaints. First, it was a cease and desist order. Karen, not understanding the gravity of the situation, ignored it. Then came the lawsuit. It was only when she was served court papers that Karen began to realize she might have gone too far. Rumors spread quickly around the neighborhood. People started whispering about how Karen had messed with the wrong person. "She's really in for it now," one neighbor said. "I heard the judge is taking her to court." Karen, still in denial, believed she could handle it. After all, she had always gotten her way before. Why should this be any different? What she didn't understand was that this wasn't just a neighborly dispute. The judge wasn't just going after her as an HOA president. He was going after her as a lawbreaker. But even as the court date loomed closer, Karen refused to back down. She continued to act as if nothing had changed, still parading around the neighborhood with her clipboard, still issuing her ridiculous demands. Little did she know, the storm was just beginning. The judge had only shown her the tip of the iceberg, and what was coming next would be something she never expected. Karen had no idea what kind of trouble she had brought upon herself. But she would soon find out. As the court date approached, the tension in the neighborhood grew. Everyone knew that Karen had gone too far, but no one knew just how serious the situation had become. The day Karen stood in court, she finally began to realize the gravity of her actions. The judge was calm, collected, and methodical, presenting a case that left no room for doubt. Karen, on the other hand, was completely unprepared. She thought she could talk her way out of it, as she always had, but this wasn't a situation she could charm her way through. When Karen entered the courtroom, she still held her head high. After all, how serious could this really be? In her mind, this was just another angry homeowner making a fuss over something trivial. She had dealt with complaints before and managed to get away with her heavy-handed HOA tactics. But this wasn't just another homeowner. This was a federal judge, and she was about to find out what that really meant. The courtroom was silent as the judge began his opening statement. He didn't raise his voice or show any sign of anger. His calm demeanor made it all the more intimidating. He laid out the facts clearly. Karen had ordered the removal of protected trees without the proper permits, trespassed on federal property, and overstepped her authority as HOA president. Every detail was precise, leaving no room for Karen's usual excuses. As the judge spoke, Karen's confidence started to crumble. She had always been able to rely on her charm and authority as HOA president, but now she was facing something far more serious. This wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. This was about breaking actual laws, laws she hadn't even bothered to understand. The judge's legal team presented evidence that left Karen speechless. Photographs of the trees, legal documents showing the protections they were under, and testimony from neighbors who had witnessed the entire incident. Karen had nothing to counter with. She hadn't done her homework, hadn't prepared, and now it was too late. As the judge laid out the damages, Karen's eyes widened. The financial cost alone was staggering. Replanting the trees, paying fines for violating local ordinances, and covering the legal fees, it was more than she had ever imagined. But that wasn't the worst part. The judge wasn't just seeking financial compensation. He was going after Karen's position in the HOA as well. Karen sat in stunned silence as the judge made his closing remarks. He made it clear that this wasn't just about the trees. It was about Karen's abuse of power, her disregard for the law, and her arrogance in thinking she could do whatever she wanted without consequence. By the time he finished speaking, there was no doubt left in anyone's mind. Karen had not only lost the case, she had lost everything. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as the judge ruled in favor of the homeowner. Karen's punishment wasn't just financial. She was stripped of her role as HOA president, barred from holding any future positions of authority within the community, and ordered to publicly apologize for her actions. It was a devastating blow, one that Karen had never seen coming. But as Karen left the courtroom that day, her face pale and her confidence shattered, she still couldn't fully grasp what had just happened. She had spent years controlling the neighborhood, pushing people around, and getting her way. But now it was all over. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. News of the courtroom showdown spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. It was all anyone could talk about. Karen, the once untouchable HOA president, had been taken down in the most public and humiliating way possible. And not by just anyone, but by the very homeowner she had targeted. The neighborhood had always been divided when it came to Karen. Some feared her, others despised her, but most just tried to stay out of her way. But now, the balance of power had shifted. People no longer looked at Karen with the same fear they once did. She had lost her authority, and without it, she was just another neighbor, no different from anyone else. As the days passed, Karen became something of a pariah. Neighbors who once avoided her now openly criticized her. The people who had suffered under her strict rules and constant interference were finally speaking up. It was about time someone put her in her place, one neighbor said. She thought she could control everything. Karen, on the other hand, withdrew from the community. She stopped making her rounds, stopped sending out notices, and avoided everyone. It was as if the very thing that had defined her, her role as HOA president, had been stripped away, leaving her with nothing. The once powerful Karen was now a shadow of her former self, her reputation in ruins. The judge, however, remained as calm and composed as ever. He didn't boast about his victory or seek out any additional attention. For him, it wasn't about revenge or humiliating Karen, it was about justice. Karen had broken the law, and now she was paying the price. But the judge didn't need to say anything. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. Despite Karen's fall from grace, there were still those who wondered if she would try to bounce back. After all, someone like Karen didn't give up easily. But for now, at least, the neighborhood was at peace. The trees may have been gone, but the sense of relief among the residents was palpable. Karen's reign of terror was over, and for the first time in a long time, people felt like they could breathe easy. But deep down, everyone knew that this wasn't the end of Karen. People like her didn't just disappear quietly into the background. No, Karen would try to find a way to regain her power. And when she did, the neighborhood would have to be ready. Karen's life had changed dramatically since the courtroom loss. She was no longer the feared HOA president, and her influence in the community had evaporated. But Karen wasn't one to give up so easily. As she sat alone in her house, she began plotting her next move. She was determined to regain the control she had lost, no matter what it took. Days turned into weeks, and Karen's frustration grew. She had been humiliated, stripped of her power, and ostracized by her neighbors. But in her mind, none of it was her fault. She still believed that she had done the right thing by cutting down those trees, and she was convinced that the judge had used his position to punish her unfairly. That's when Karen came up with a desperate plan. If she couldn't regain her power through the HOA, she would find another way to make the judge pay. She started digging into his past, searching for anything she could use against him. Karen knew that everyone had skeletons in their closet, and she was determined to find his. But what Karen didn't realize was that the judge had nothing to hide. He had lived a life of integrity, and no matter how hard she looked, she couldn't find a single thing to use against him. Karen's frustration only deepened as her search for dirt on the judge turned up nothing. She couldn't understand how someone could be so clean, so untouchable. But Karen wasn't one to give up. She believed that everyone had a weak spot, and she was determined to find his. As days passed, Karen became more obsessed with her plan. She spent hours poring over court records, digging through old neighborhood documents, and even trying to eavesdrop on conversations about the judge. She became so consumed with her mission that she barely left her house. The neighbors noticed her absence, but no one seemed to care. After her public downfall, most people were glad that Karen had retreated into the shadows. But Karen wasn't just plotting in secret. She started making subtle moves to regain her influence in the community. She quietly began speaking with a few remaining HOA board members who still sympathized with her. She promised them that if they supported her, she would find a way to take back control of the HOA. They were hesitant at first. No one wanted to cross the judge again, but Karen was persuasive. She had a way of making people feel like she was their only hope. Soon, Karen was back to her old tricks, but this time she was more careful. She didn't make any bold moves or public announcements. Instead, she worked in the background, slowly rebuilding her network of supporters. It wasn't long before she had a small group of loyal followers who believed that Karen could restore order to the neighborhood. They blamed the judge for the chaos that had followed her removal, and they were eager to see Karen back in charge. But Karen's plan was far from foolproof. The judge was no fool, and he had been keeping an eye on Karen ever since the court case. He knew that someone like her wouldn't simply disappear. She was too power-hungry, too determined to let go of her influence. So when he started hearing whispers about Karen's meetings and secret plans, he wasn't surprised. What did surprise him was just how far Karen was willing to go. One day, a letter arrived at the judge's house. It wasn't signed, but the message was clear: you may have won the battle, but the war isn't over. The judge knew immediately that it was from Karen. She was sending a warning, letting him know that she wasn't done with him yet. But the judge didn't react. He simply folded the letter and put it away. He had expected something like this, and he was ready. Karen, on the other hand, thought she had finally found a way to rattle the judge. She believed that her anonymous threats would scare him into backing down, maybe even stepping down from his position as HOA member. But once again, Karen underestimated the judge. He wasn't someone who could be intimidated, and he certainly wasn't going to back down from someone like Karen. As Karen's plans continued to unfold, the tension in the neighborhood began to rise once again. People could sense that something was brewing, even if they didn't know exactly what. Some of Karen's loyal followers started spreading rumors about the judge, trying to paint him as a corrupt official who had abused his power. But the judge's reputation was solid, and most people didn't believe the lies. Karen was growing desperate. She had hoped that by now, the judge would have made a mistake, something she could exploit. But he remained calm, composed, and untouchable. Every move she made seemed to backfire, and Karen was running out of options. But in her mind, there was still one last thing she could do, something drastic, something that would force the judge to confront her directly. Karen's final plan was reckless, even by her standards. She had decided that if she couldn't find a way to bring down the judge legally, she would have to confront him face to face. It was a bold move, and one that could easily backfire. But Karen was beyond caring about consequences. She was convinced that the judge had wronged her, and she was determined to make him pay. One evening, just as the sun was setting, Karen marched up to the judge's house. She didn't bother knocking. Instead, she pounded on the door with such force that the sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood. When the judge opened the door, Karen didn't wait for an invitation to speak. "You think you've won, don't you?" Karen spat, her voice shaking with anger. "You think you can just take everything away from me and get away with it?" The judge didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, looking at Karen with the same calm expression he always wore. But Karen wasn't interested in his silence. She wanted to fight. "You ruined my life," Karen shouted, her face red with fury. "You took everything from me, my position, my reputation. And for what? Because I cut down some trees." The judge finally spoke, his voice steady and measured. "Karen, this was never about the trees. This was about the law. You broke it, and you had to face the consequences." Karen's fists clenched at her sides. "I don't care about your laws. I did what was best for this neighborhood, and you ruined me for it." The judge shook his head slowly. "No, Karen. You ruined yourself. You abused your power, and now you're facing the consequences. This isn't about me or the HOA. This is about your actions." For a moment, Karen seemed to falter. She had expected the judge to argue, to defend himself, but his calm response left her with nothing to fight against. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. For the first time, Karen realized that maybe, just maybe, she was the one at fault. But Karen wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. "You haven't seen the last of me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll find a way to take you down. Just wait." Without waiting for a response, Karen turned and stormed away, leaving the judge standing in the doorway. But as she walked down the street, something strange happened. For the first time since her fall from grace, Karen felt a sense of doubt creeping in. Was she really in the right? Or had she been blinded by her own ambition? Karen didn't have an answer, but one thing was certain. Her fight with the judge wasn't over. Not yet. In the weeks that followed, Karen's attempts to regain control continued to fail. Her supporters dwindled, her influence in the neighborhood vanished, and even the few remaining HOA members who had sided with her began to distance themselves. As Karen's schemes unraveled, her isolation deepened. The neighborhood that she had once dominated now wanted nothing to do with her. Her desperate attempts to maintain control had only further tarnished her already fragile reputation. People whispered about her at community events, shook their heads when they saw her, and avoided any contact. Karen, however, refused to acknowledge her defeat. She still held onto the belief that she could somehow rise again. But the truth was, no one was interested in her plans anymore. The HOA had moved on without her, and so had the neighborhood. The judge, with his calm and fair demeanor, had earned the trust of the community. People respected him not just for his position, but for how he handled Karen's reign of chaos with such grace. One evening, as Karen sat alone in her home, she began to reflect. The silence was deafening. For the first time, she faced the reality of her situation. Her power, her influence, her reputation, it was all gone. And it wasn't the judge who had taken it from her. It was her own actions. She had destroyed everything she once held dear by refusing to listen, refusing to compromise, and refusing to see past her own ego. She thought about the trees she had cut down, how something so small had spiraled into such a massive disaster. It wasn't about the trees, after all. It was about her need for control, her need to be right, no matter the cost. The realization hit Karen like a wave. All the fights, all the schemes, all the anger, what had it been for? She had alienated her neighbors, tarnished her name, and ruined her own life. And for what? To feel powerful for a fleeting moment? But now it was too late. The damage was done. As the weeks turned into months, Karen faded into obscurity. She no longer attended HOA meetings or tried to influence neighborhood decisions. Her few remaining allies distanced themselves, and her name was rarely mentioned anymore. The once feared HOA Karen had become nothing more than a memory of the neighborhood's past. The judge, on the other hand, continued to serve the community with fairness and integrity. His calm leadership helped the neighborhood flourish, and the HOA returned to its original purpose, maintaining peace and order for everyone, not just a select few. In the end, Karen's fate was sealed by her own actions. She had fought for control, but in doing so, she had lost everything that truly mattered. The neighborhood moved forward, and Karen, the once powerful force, was left behind, a cautionary tale of what happens when power and pride blind a person to reason and community. And so, the story of the HOA Karen came to a quiet, unremarkable end. The trees she had cut down never grew back, but in the end, it was Karen herself who had been cut down by her own hand. The judge, however, continued to serve, always reminding the neighborhood of the importance of fairness, respect, and humility. The lesson was clear. In the end, those who use power to harm others only destroy themselves.